Hey everybody, this is Mr. Storm. In this video, we are going to create a new project in Godot. This project is not going to be as extensive as our Pong project. Basically, we're going to just make a clicker game. We're going to make a fun little clicker game. Shouldn't be too crazy. It'll be, I don't know, it'll be a fun game. Let me show you an example of what I'm talking about. Let me just go ahead and run, and I'll bring this over into my screen. So we're going to make a game that looks like this. Basically, that has a button. When you click the button, you get some currency. We're going to call our currency bits. When you get enough bits, you can buy a resource. And when you buy that resource, it generates bits per second so that it automatically generates bits for me, and I can keep going, and I can buy even more. That's essentially the game we're going to make. My game here has 6 buttons. We'll probably only make, I don't know, let's make 3. I'll show you how to do the first 2, and then you'll have to make the third one on your own. All right. Cool. So how do we build this? Well, we're going to start with, let's switch to 2D view. We want to start with a specific node. Now, we've already talked about 2D scene nodes. We used that when we created our Pong project. Let's use the user interface node for this, because if you remember the example that I just showed you, the project, there's no actual physics or anything going on. It's basically just a user interface. There's buttons for us to click, and that's pretty much it. So let's use a user interface as our root node, and that gives us something called control. Control is the user interface root node for all the UI elements that we want to use. So I'm going to rename this to game. And notice that control, it covers the entire screen. That's perfect for us. We can shrink the screen size if we want. We can change how much of this screen this control covers, but we like the default because it covers the whole thing. All right, let's go ahead and change our project settings. Let's go down to rendering and environment, and let's give ourselves a nice blue background. I like, let's see. That looks pretty good. That might be a bit too bright, maybe a little bit softer. Looks good to me. All right, now let's start adding some things to the project. First, let's add our button that when we click, it creates or it gives us a new resource. So I'm going to click this plus, and I'm going to look for a specific node. The node I'm looking for is called a texture button. A texture button will allow us to add a sprite resource to a specific button. Okay, so we're going to go texture button. There we go, and create. And it puts it right up over here. Let's rename this real quick. We'll rename it to bits button. Okay, all right, so this texture button, we want to add a texture to it. So where do we do that? Well, if we look over here in the inspector, we have this drop-down option for textures. If we open that up, we have all these options: normal, pressed, hover, disabled, focus, whatever. So if we had a button that had a normal state, it just looked normal, and then when we pressed it, it changed to a different thing, and then we hover over it, it changed to a different thing, we could use different textures to represent the different states of this button. For us, we're just going to use a normal, we're just going to use the normal. And we're just going to use our Godot icon here and drop that in. Okay? Perfect. Let's go ahead and resize this so it's nice and, oh, hello. Notice that when I resize, it's not actually changing the size of my button here. The texture isn't growing with it. So what we want to do is we want to go up here to stretch mode, and we want to use keep aspect. Let's do that. So that way it'll grow my button, but keep the aspect ratio of the button. Okay, perfect. So I'll put my nice big button right there in the middle. All right, now let's create some labels. Let's create the bits label that goes up here and the bits per second label that goes down here. All right, so I'm going to make sure that they're children of the game node. Everything's going to be a child of our root node for this project. So let's go ahead and click plus. What we're looking for is a label. A label. Labels will give us just basic text that we can put on our screen. We played around with labels in our Pong project. And I'm going to write bits. Let's make it 100,000. That way we can see how much, or we can see like the big text. Basically, we're going to choose a large number so that we can see what it looks like with a super large number. All right. I'm going to go to my theme overrides. I'm going to change the font sizes. Let's try 30. Maybe not. That's too small. Let's try 50. 50 looks pretty good to me. I like 50. Let's also set its horizontal alignment to center. Okay. Looks good. All right. So it's center aligned. It's going to be over that button. Let's rename the label to bits label. And let's go ahead and duplicate this label and drag this new label down below. And we'll rename this to BPS label. And in the text, we'll say BPS is 100,000. Okay, so now we have a label for our bits and a label for our bits per second. Okay, perfect. All righty. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Let's go ahead and create let's actually get this button working. So let's add a script to our root node, to our game node. And let's click create. Okay, perfect. So now in this script, we have our ready function, we have our process function. Let's think about what we need. Well, we're going to need a variable to store how many bits we have. So let's create a variable called bits. And we're going to need a variable to store how many bits per second we have. We can actually do that on one line now that I'm thinking about it. So we can save ourselves some space. Can we? Apparently we can't. I was thinking another programming language. My fault. We'll create two different variables, one called bits, one called BPS. And when the game starts, we want to initialize these variables with some values, with some information. So we'll say bits equals 0, BPS equals 0. Okay? Perfect. Now, what we want to do inside our process function, let's set the text of these labels to be equal to whatever the bits and the BPS is right now. So what we can do is we can grab a reference to this child using the $sign. So we do $sign, and then we can go to, let's say, bits label dot text equals bits colon, and we're going to give a space there so our number's not squished up against the words. And we're going to add a string. Now, doing this means we're going to take a number. Right now, this is a number. We're going to convert it into a string so that it can be added into this label. Labels can only have strings, right? So we're going to convert this into a string, and we'll say bits. So we're going to take this variable, and we're going to convert it into a string and display it on the screen. Let's do the same thing for BPS label. Oh, I went too far. Dot text equals BPS plus string BPS. Perfect. So now let's go ahead and save this. Let's save the scene. And let's run our game. We'll select current. Okay, so now we have a button. We have 0 bits, 0 BPS. Okay. So far, we know our script is working because in our game scene, it was 100,000, but when we run our game, it goes to 0. And that's because in our script, we told it to turn to 0 at the very beginning of the game. Perfect. So now we need to deal with how do we get this button to actually add to the bits whenever we press the button. Well, for that, we're going to use a signal. So let's go to this bits button, and let's go to the signal here. The signal we're looking for is pressed. So whenever the button is pressed, we want to trigger something in this script. So let's double click that. Want to make sure it's connecting to the game node and click connect. Now we have a new function here inside our game script. And it says on bits button pressed. So what we need to do is write, basically we just need to increase bits by 1. So that's really easy to do. We'll just say bits plus equals 1. So when this button is pressed, all we do is increase our bits by 1. Super simple. Let's test it out and see if that works. All right, so we're at 0. Let's click there. Now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There we go. We've got a clicker game, ladies and gentlemen. It is working. Beautiful, 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 beautiful. All right, so our script is working. Now, let's talk about these other buttons that we're going to put over here, the resource buttons. We'll work on bits per second here in a minute. We kind of need a resource before we can program that. So for that, we're going to need a different button. So this button that we're going to use is just a regular button. We don't want a texture. We're just going to use a regular button node for this. And I'm going to rename this. Let's call this, I don't know, mobile game. Okay, make a mobile game. And notice that it put it right up here, and it's really small. Let me go ahead and make it nice and big so I can grab it and bring it over here. And let's put it kind of where I want it to go. We'll say right there. That looks pretty good. And then over in the inspector, let's set the text for this button itself. So let's say the mobile game. Let's give it a cost. Its cost is going to be 10 bits, and it's going to produces, let's say 1 bits per second. 1 bits per second. Okay, and let's make the font a little bit bigger here. Theme overrides, fonts, or font sizes, sorry. Font size. Let's set it to 25. There we go. Perfect. All right, so now we have a button that whenever we click it, we want it to allow us to buy one of these and produce 1 bit per second. Okay, perfect. All right, let's go back to our script and take a look at how we can do that. Well, we have our mobile game button here, and we have a pressed function that we can bring in. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's bring in our pressed function. Alrighty, so now when we press that, we want to do 2 things, right? We want to add to our bits per second, and we also want to remove from the amount of bits we have, because we have to actually buy this thing with bits. So let's do let's remove the bits first. How much did we say? It was 10 bits. So we'll say bits. Oh, I'm still capitalized. Bits minus equals 10. And how many bits per second? It's 1. So we can say BPS plus equals 1. So now whenever I press that button, it should reduce my bits by 10 and give us 1 bits per second. So let's go ahead and test that out. All right, when I push it, notice that I now have negative 10 bits and I have 1 bits per second. So that button is working exactly as we expect. Okay, perfect. All righty. Let's get our bits per seconds working. Or, actually, there are a couple things we can do. We can work on bits per second, or we can actually turn this thing off. Notice that we went negative. We don't want to actually be able to click this button unless we have enough bits. So, luckily, we have a script that can help us to do that. We have our process function here, which is constantly checking for things within our game. So, let's just write an if statement that just basically says if our bits is less than 10, then we're going to turn off that button. Okay? So it's actually pretty easy to do. Let's do it. Okay, make sure you're inside the process function. If you do this anywhere else, it's not going to work. So we'll say if bits is less than 10, then we're going to access that child. Remember $sign because children are expensive. We're going to go to the mobile game button, and we'll say dot disabled equals true. So what that means is basically we're going to set the property of this button, disabled, this disabled property, to true. So we're going to turn it on, meaning we're going to disable it. I know that's confusing, but we're going to turn on the disabled property. Okay. Now if we have 10 or more bits, then we want to mobile game dot disabled equal false, meaning we're actually allowing it to turn back on. So let's test that out. So notice that it's now disabled. I can click it all I want and it's not going to do anything. But when I get, something happened. I clicked enough and then, I see what I did. Do you notice my error yet? It says invalid assignment of property, key, diabled. I misspelled disabled. I forgot my S. All right, let's try this again. Now it's disabled. And when I click the bits and I get 10, it turns on and I can spend my bits and I get 1 bits per second and the button turns off again because I don't have enough bits to spend. Okay, perfect. So we're almost there. Now all we have to do is we have to create the ability for our bits per second to give us more bits over time. For that, we're going to need something called a timer. So luckily there's a node in Godot that will allow us to create a timer. I'm going to grab this timer node and add it into my scene. Then if we look at our nodes that we have that we can use to trigger events in the game, we have a timeout event. Let's grab that. Let's double click that and add it to our game script. So now we have a timeout function, on timer timeout, meaning whenever this timer is done ticking, and it's going to tick once per second. We also want to click auto start because we want to turn it on right away. We want to have this automatically start. So at the end of each second, it's going to do whatever's inside of this function. And so what we want it to do is essentially add the amount of bits per second to our total bit count, right? So let's say on timer timeout, let's say bits plus equals BPS. Very easy math to do, right? So we're going to take our total bits, we're going to add whatever our BPS is to our bits every time this timer is done. So let's hit play, see what happens. So we have 0 bits per second. Let's go ahead and buy let's buy a resource. And now we have 1 bits per second. And look, every second we're getting more bits. Okay, so now our timer is working. Perfect. The only thing we have left to do is build more resources. Like I said, I'm only going to have you do 3. We have 1 right now. Let's create another one. I'm going to duplicate this one. And instead of mobile game, let's call this one VR game. Okay, this is going to be a VR game. Let's move it down. And you guys can name these whatever you want, by the way. You don't have to go with my names or the amounts that I'm charging for these things. It's completely up to you what you guys want to do. I want to see your creativity in this project as well. All right, cool. So now we have our VR game button. If we go to our node, it copied our signal. That may not be what we want. We probably don't want the signal to be copied over because if we look at our script here, now it's going to be, it's still that mobile game pressed. So we probably don't want that. Let's remove this signal. We can do that by right-clicking and saying disconnect. And now notice our signal icon is gone. And the script is still perfectly fine. Okay, so now if we reattach that signal, it'll say on VR game pressed. When we click connect, it'll add an on VR game pressed function into our script, and we can do the same thing we did right here. Let's just actually I hit the wrong key. Let's copy and paste this code in, and we can change it. So we're going to subtract 100, and we're going to increase by 10. Ooh, there's one more thing we need to do. We need another set of if-else statements to handle if bits is less than 100. Then we want to turn off the VR game button and let's say else. Oop. Equals false. Okay, so now my VR game button should be working. Let's go ahead and hit play and test it out. So it's disabled now. Let's grab some bits. Perfect. Now I'm getting bits per second. All right, I'm flying through this. Let's buy some more. Beautiful, beautiful. Now I'm getting 5 bits per second. So I'm getting even more bits. Let's get to 100 so I can buy a VR game. All right. So we got 100. Now my VR game button turns on. When I click this, notice I'm now getting 15 bits per second. So it's exponentially better. Yay. All right. So I did mobile game, VR game. Add a third button down here. So far, at this point, you've already done these steps twice. So you should be able to add the third game on your own. Add another game down there on the bottom. And test it out. Make sure it works. And when you're done, turn in your project, and I'll see you next time. All right. Thanks for paying attention.